In this topic, we'll be talking about introduction to body systems, specifically the organization of the human body. We'll be looking at tissues, what tissues are made of, and going up from there to organs, organ systems, and eventually to entire multicellular organisms such as ourselves. For those of you who are taking this class as a prerequisite for going on to allied health or nursing programs, one of the next courses you'll take is anatomy and physiology. But I'd like to distinguish between the two. Although they're taught together, they are separate things. Anatomy is looking at the form of, in this case, the human body. What are the individual parts? So it could be something as simple as memorizing the different bones in the body, or looking at the actual structure of the heart, the fact that it has 4 chambers that are involved in pumping blood. And by looking at the anatomy, we're able to infer some information about what that part does. And what it does, that's the physiology, how those things function. So down here, we're able to see this little squiggly line. And this printout, if you're not familiar with this is called an electrocardiogram. Oftentimes you'll see it abbreviated as an ECG or an EKG, and it's a readout of electrical activity within the heart. And in a later topic, we'll explore that further and talk about how that relates to different aspects of heart function. And a cardiologist can examine an EKG and diagnose if there's a potential problem with the electrical signaling in your heart. So again, anatomy is what the parts are, physiology is what they do. So previously, in our environmental topic, we had talked about the hierarchy of sustainability: reduce, reuse, then recycle, and dispose last of all. And remember that a hierarchy was an ordered structure or sequence of things, and the same is true here, that the bodies of animals, including our own, can be organized into this hierarchy. And we'll talk about that in the next few slides, the actual order of structures within the human body. And as I briefly mentioned in the previous slide, there's a direct connection between the form of something and its function. For example, on your car, if you had square wheels instead of round ones, it wouldn't work as well. That form of having a round wheel is very important for it to function properly. Or if you had a bottle of bottled water and it was open on both ends, well, that form wouldn't work with the function that you need to hold water in there and drink out of one end. So there's this connection between the two. And what that means is a lot of times if you know one piece of information but not the other, you can get a general idea about how that form and that function go hand in hand. So I'd like you to pause for a second and look at these 4 different parts of the human body: the heart, circulatory system, cardiac muscle, which is just muscle of the heart, and cardiac cells. And I want you to think about how you could put this into a hierarchy, going from most inclusive, essentially like the biggest category, down to least inclusive, the smallest category. So pause the video, take a minute to think about this, and then I'll reveal the answers. Okay, so let's take a look here. We have the circulatory system, one of the organ systems in the body, and the circulatory system includes the heart as part of it, but the heart's not the only thing involved to pump blood around the body. You also need blood vessels, arteries, capillaries, and veins. Together, those, plus something called our lymphatic vessels, make up the circulatory system. The heart is one organ within that system, so it's a smaller part. Cardiac muscle is one part of the heart. And then lastly, cardiac cells, thousands and thousands of these, make up this cardiac muscle tissue. So these are the different levels of organization we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this topic. We're going to be talking about the most basic unit of life, and that's cells. We haven't been able to find anything else living that doesn't at least have one cell. We'll talk about how groups of cells are organized together. Oops, I apologize for this. I'm using a new pen, trying it out. Takes some getting used to. Multiple cells are working together, forming what are called tissues. Groups of tissues form organs. Groups of organs form organ systems. And then the human body consists of 11 different organ systems. So lots of those to make our entire body. And don't worry if you didn't get all that. On the next slides, we'll define these in writing. So as I'd mentioned, a tissue is a group of cells that are working together. Within the bodies of animals, you'll find a variety of different tissue types. You should be familiar, after we go through this here, with these 4 main categories of tissue types: connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. We're going to go through and talk about the functions of each of these different types of tissues, but some of them you should be able to at least guess the function. Muscle tissue, right? We know what muscle does. It helps with movement. Nervous tissue, what does our nervous system do? It transmits information electrically, etc. And so we'll go through and highlight these key functions here. So as the name suggests, connective tissue helps to connect things. It acts as a supportive tissue. For example, structural support as bone. Bone is one type of connective tissue. When bone and bone come together, you don't want them to be directly rubbing, otherwise they would erode and wear away. And that happens a lot of times in arthritis, which leads them to pain, joint dislocation, and things like that. So instead we have this pad that's between bones, where joints are located, called cartilage. You'll also find cartilage in your ear, which is why it's so flexible, tip of your nose, and many other locations. That's another connective tissue. Blood is a liquid connective tissue. Oftentimes we might not think of it as a tissue, but it actually is. And the way it's connecting is it's transporting vital nutrients and removing wastes and delivering cells and antibodies and other things all around the body. So it's connecting different things like a train kind of does, connecting cities together. Does anyone know what adipose tissue is? Adipose tissue is fat tissue. So there are cells called adipocytes. Adipocytes are fat cells. It's a fancy way to say fat cells. It's ending here, cyte, something we introduced in lab, means cell. So adipose, fat cells. Now, your skin is not a tissue. Your skin is actually the largest organ in the body. And we're saying largest organ, that's in terms of the actual volume of it, all the space it occupies. The nervous system is then an organ system. It's a group of things working together. The brain, spinal cord, all of the nerves that branch off of those 2 organs. But they're made of tissues. And so our skin, one of the main tissues that's present as part of that organ, is called epithelial tissue. We did a lab earlier where we scraped the inside of our cheek to collect epithelial cells, to look at them under a microscope. That was epithelial tissue. You can see that it covers not only the outside of our body, but also the inside. All the tubes that are inside our body or passageways that ultimately lead out are covered with epithelial tissue. It provides some protection so that those don't wear away. Also involved in secreting things like sweat, oil, etc., and absorbing nutrients in the digestive system. Then we have nervous tissue. Nervous tissue allows for very, very rapid electrical communication from your brain and spinal cord. Your brain and spinal cord, they are located in the center of the body, right, to protect them. And so we refer to those organs as our central nervous system. And there are other nerves then that branch off of those, either collecting information from the outside, like you put your hand on something hot and it tells you that it's hot, or transmitting some information back out, like to pull your hand back from a hot surface. And so that is all transmitted electrically from one place to another very, very rapidly, in terms of milliseconds, which would be thousandths of a second. And then lastly, of those four major tissue types we introduced, there's the muscle tissue. And muscle tissue consists of cells that are called muscle fibers. And we call them fibers because, in science we like to make things more complicated. But actually, it's really because they're very long cells, very, very long. If you remember our cheek cells were kind of roundish, but muscle cells are very, very, very long. And so they go like these strings, like fibers in clothing. And these contain proteins that will contract to shorten those cells, which then helps to produce movement. And so there's three main types of muscle tissue. One is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is what we call involuntary. Involuntary means that it is not under conscious control. I'll get this pen down eventually here. It's not something that we have to think about or our brain is actively kind of processing information. It's just happening automatically from our nervous system. And you'll find smooth muscle inside of our blood vessels, but also within the digestive tract itself to kind of propel food down through a process we'll learn about in a little bit called peristalsis, moving it down towards the stomach from our mouth. Next is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, just like smooth muscle, is also involuntary. You can fall asleep and don't have to worry about your heart stopping, hopefully, because it is happening automatically. There are built-in electrical bundles inside your heart that are causing your heart to continue to beat, and there's also outside input though that can influence that, but it's involuntary. There is some degree you can control your heart rate by meditating or other things to slow it down a little bit, but most people can't actually stop their heart by focusing on it. That's only found in heart tissue. And lastly, the type of muscle that we're probably most familiar with is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is the opposite of involuntary, it is voluntary, which means that it is under conscious control. You can manipulate your skeletal muscle, reaching for things, walking, talking, all these things that you can consciously manipulate. Some of them happen so fast that you're not really thinking about walking like one foot in front of the other, but it is something that you can stop and control if you want to. So far we've talked about cells and tissues. Now we're going to talk about these remaining two levels of organization in this hierarchy. Organs. I've mentioned organs before, like the heart. An organ is a group of tissues that is working together. So the heart contains all four major tissue types. And this is true actually for most organs. Most organs have all four tissue types. Take the heart. The heart, of course, is very muscular. It has to pump blood around the body. But if the heart was just muscle tissue, it would be a flat piece of muscle, kind of like a steak, and it wouldn't have the right shape to have blood inside of it. And so instead, it's a combination of muscle tissue and connective tissue that gives the heart its distinctive shape, and that muscle is kind of woven around that structure. But if you just had that, it wouldn't do anything. So you need some nervous tissue. For now you have an electrical signal telling it to pump. And lastly, you need to have some epithelial tissue, because when any liquid goes across the surface, it causes some of that surface to wash away. Just think about a river running quickly along, it erodes the banks. And the same is true with your blood. As your blood pushes through your blood vessels and your heart, it pushes cells and rips cells off the aside essentially, and you got to replace those. And so epithelial tissue is present, replacing those that fall off and protecting underlying cells from damage. So most organs have all four of those major tissue groups. And then, like we said before, an organ system, sometimes called a body system. Go ahead and write that down here. Is a group of organs working together. So with your digestive system, you've got your mouth, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, large intestine, your liver, your gallbladder, your pancreas, many organs involved in that organ system. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys this short video. This video is demonstrating a technological advancement that's just developed in the last several years, and it's the ability to actually take human cells, put them on these little tiny microchips, and run things like blood or fluid with bacteria in it or air across the surface of these cells, and then have it hooked up to computers to emulate a human organ and measure how it responds. And this holds a lot of promise for potentially testing new drugs and getting faster at approving those drugs and maybe reducing animal testing, and possibly one day you might not need it if we can get this to be sophisticated enough. So take a look at this short video. All right, so that finishes up this introductory topic to human tissues, organs, organ systems, and this hierarchy of biological organization.